I'm a 32-year-old guy, and for as long as I can remember, my sister has had a knack for taking control of every situation. She's 35, the eldest in the family, and has always carried herself like she's the CEO of everything: family events, decisions, and even our lives. Growing up, it was annoying but manageable. As adults, though, her need for control has caused some serious tension, especially since I got married. My wife and I have been together for 5 years, married for 3. She's smart, kind, and gets along with most of my family, except my sister. From day one, my sister has treated her like an outsider. It wasn't blatant, more like those subtle jabs that only the person on the receiving end really notices. My wife usually brushed it off, but over time it became clear that my sister just didn't like her. When my sister announced her wedding, everyone expected it to be a grand affair. She's the type who lives for big, showy events, so nobody was surprised when the invitations started rolling in. What did surprise me was the envelope that arrived at our house. It was addressed to me only. No mention of my wife. At first I thought it was a mistake, but when I opened the card, there was no doubt my wife wasn't invited. I called my sister to clarify. She didn't beat around the bush. She said my wife wasn't welcome because the budget was tight and they wanted to keep the peace. She didn't explain what that meant, but I knew exactly what she was implying. I reminded her that my wife is family now and asked how she thought this was okay. She doubled down, saying it was her wedding, her rules, and she didn't need to justify herself to anyone. I tried to get my parents involved, thinking they'd talk some sense into her, but they just shrugged it off, saying it was her day and I should respect her wishes. They even suggested I attend alone to avoid making waves. It felt like a slap in the face. How was I supposed to sit through my sister's wedding while my wife, who's done nothing wrong, sat at home? When I told my wife about it, she was surprisingly calm. She said she understood and that I should go without her, but I could tell it hurt her. She tried to hide it, but her eyes gave it away. That's when I decided no way was I leaving her behind. If my sister wanted to exclude her, then she'd have to exclude me too. Without telling my sister, I RSVP'd for 2. My wife and I decided to show up together and hope for the best. Maybe it would be awkward at first, but I figured once we were there, it wouldn't be a big deal. People would be too busy enjoying the day to care. On the wedding day, we arrived during the cocktail hour. We kept things low-key, stuck to ourselves, and tried to blend in. For a moment, it felt like maybe we'd pull it off. But that moment didn't last. My sister spotted us from across the room, and her expression said it all. She stormed over and pulled me aside, hissing that I'd ruined her day by bringing my wife. I tried to explain that I couldn't come without her, that it didn't feel right. But she wasn't having it. Her voice got louder, and soon everyone around us was staring. She demanded my wife leave immediately, claiming she'd explicitly banned her, and that I'd disrespected her wishes. Some relatives tried to calm her down, but others started chiming in, siding with her. It quickly became a full-blown scene. Guests whispered, drinks were awkwardly sipped, and the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My wife stood off to the side, trying to stay out of it, but it was clear she was humiliated. My sister escalated things by calling over the event security. Yes, she had security at her wedding. She ordered them to escort us out. I told her if my wife was leaving, so was I. That's when she yelled, in front of everyone, that I wasn't welcome at her wedding anymore. The security guards didn't rough us up or anything, but they made it clear we had to go. We left without looking back. That night, we found a quiet restaurant nearby, ordered a couple of drinks, and just sat there. Neither of us said much. We were too drained to even process what had happened. It was supposed to be a celebration, and instead, it felt like we'd been thrown out of our own family. The fallout started almost immediately. My parents called the next day, furious. They blamed me for causing a scene and ruining my sister's wedding. They said she had every right to dictate who came and that I'd disrespected her. I argued back, but it was like talking to a wall. My sister had spun the narrative to make herself the victim, and most of the family believed her. That's how it all started, the wedge between me, my wife, and my family. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of a much bigger storm. Update 1. The morning after the wedding, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Calls, texts, notifications, I didn't even need to open them to know what they were about. My parents were first. They called to say how ashamed they were of me for causing such a spectacle. Apparently, my sister had told them I showed up to her wedding uninvited and forced my wife into an event where she wasn't wanted. They didn't ask for my side of the story. They just parroted what she told them. I was disrespectful, my wife was manipulative, and we had ruined her big day. I didn't argue. It was clear they had already chosen their side. The family group chat was worse. I'd barely finished my coffee when it erupted with messages. My sister led the charge, painting a picture of my wife as some unhinged villain who had crashed the wedding to spite her. Relatives chimed in one by one, either siding with her or throwing in their own 2 cents about how family comes first and how I needed to make this right. I tried to defend myself. I pointed out that I RSVP'd for 2 and that my wife wasn't crashing anything. We were both invited, even if it wasn't what my sister wanted. That only made things worse. My sister doubled down, claiming she'd explicitly banned my wife because of her toxic attitude. Toxic? My wife? The same woman who told me to go to the wedding alone just to avoid drama? Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all had opinions. Some called me privately to pressure me into apologizing. One even said I should write my sister a formal letter to smooth things over. Others just joined the pile-on in the group chat. By noon, it felt like my entire family had turned against me. My wife tried to stay out of it, but she wasn't blind to what was happening. She could see the messages pouring in on my phone, and when my parents suggested in the group chat that we shouldn't come to future family gatherings unless we apologized, She quietly put down her coffee and walked out of the room. That was when I realized how deep the damage went. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. She felt like an outsider in my family, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. A few cousins messaged me privately, saying they thought the exclusion was unfair. But even they admitted they couldn't say anything publicly. They didn't want to deal with my sister's wrath. Their silence, while understandable, made it clear just how much control my sister had over the family dynamic. Then came the social media posts. My sister flooded her accounts with wedding photos, carefully curated to show how perfect her day was. But her captions told another story. They were vague but cutting, things like, "It's always sad when people can't respect boundaries, and some people will do anything to make a day about themselves." She didn't name names, but anyone who knew about the drama could read between the lines. My wife stopped going to family events after that. I tried to convince her otherwise, but she said she didn't want to give anyone an excuse to say she was causing problems. The truth was, she felt ostracized. And the more I saw her withdraw, the angrier I became. My sister was rewriting history to paint herself as the victim, and my wife was paying the price. The final straw came at a family dinner. I decided to go alone, hoping to smooth things over without dragging my wife into it. It was a disaster. The moment I walked in, the air was thick with tension. My parents gave me a half-hearted greeting, and my sister didn't even look at me. I tried to start a conversation, but it was like talking to statues. Eventually, someone brought up the wedding, and it was as if a dam broke. My sister accused me of disrespecting her, my parents backed her up, and even a few other relatives jumped in. I told them I wasn't there to fight, but they didn't care. My sister kept saying I'd ruined her day and demanded I apologize. I refused. I said I didn't do anything wrong by bringing my wife to a family event. That only made things worse. The dinner ended with my parents saying they didn't want to see me again until I apologized to my sister. When I got home and told my wife what happened, she shook her head and said, "Enough." She told me she couldn't keep being the reason I was at odds with my family. She didn't want to be part of a dynamic where she was treated like an outsider, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to keep bending over backward to please people who clearly didn't respect me or my wife. I told my parents I wouldn't be attending any more family events unless they treated my wife as an equal. They called it an overreaction. I called it setting boundaries. The fallout wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. My sister continued her smear campaign. My parents stuck to their guns and most of the family sided with them, but I didn't care anymore. For the first time, I felt like I was standing up for my wife, for my marriage, and for myself. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and deep down, I knew it was just the beginning. Update 2. Things didn't calm down after I decided to cut contact with most of my family. In fact, they got worse. My sister wasn't content with the wedding drama. She had to make sure the fallout stuck. It started small, with whispers among mutual friends and distant relatives. A cousin called me one day, cautiously asking if it was true that my wife had crashed the wedding. I set the record straight, but it was clear the story was spreading. Apparently, my sister had been telling everyone that my wife showed up uninvited and caused a scene. She framed it as if my wife's very presence had been some malicious act of defiance, ignoring the fact that I RSVP'd for both of us. When I confronted her about it, she didn't even deny it. She just smirked and said everyone was entitled to their own version of the truth. The rumors started to affect my wife in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our shared friend group, which had always been neutral ground, became awkward. People who once invited us to casual dinners and game nights started leaving us out. One of her closest friends even messaged her, asking if she really did crash the wedding. That hurt her more than anything. She stopped going out as much and deleted her social media for a while, not wanting to see any of the fallout. I started connecting the dots and realized my sister's resentment toward my wife went deeper than I thought. A cousin, one of the few who still talked to me, mentioned offhand that my sister had complained about my wife during our wedding years ago. She'd apparently said my wife had stolen the spotlight from her because of how much attention she got. That was news to me, but it made sense. My sister wasn't just controlling, she was jealous. The social media drama kicked into overdrive when my sister made a vague but cutting post about family betrayals. It was something like, "It's funny how some people think being family gives them the right to disrespect you." Her friends flooded the comments with supportive messages, talking about how she deserved better and how some people don't know how to behave. She never named names, but the timing made it obvious. The breaking point came when a cousin sent me screenshots of private messages from my sister. She hadn't just been spreading rumors, she was actively insulting my wife, calling her names and mocking our marriage. She even joked about how long she thought we'd last before divorcing. Seeing those messages made my blood boil. My wife hadn't done anything to deserve this, and my sister was treating her like a punching bag. When I showed the screenshots to my wife, she broke down. I could see how much it was wearing on her. She wasn't just dealing with being excluded, she was being vilified, and it felt like there was nothing she could do to defend herself. She told me she didn't care what my sister or family thought of her anymore, but I knew it wasn't that simple. I decided enough was enough. I forwarded the screenshots to my parents and told them this wasn't okay. My sister's behavior had gone beyond a petty feud, it was outright bullying. I asked them to hold her accountable, but their response was predictable. They brushed it off, saying she was just venting and that I was blowing things out of proportion. They didn't even acknowledge how hurtful her words were. So I took it to the family group chat. I posted the screenshots there for everyone to see. If my sister wanted to play games, I wasn't going to sit quietly anymore. The chat exploded almost immediately. Some people were shocked, others tried to downplay it, but my sister's response was the loudest. She accused me of airing private family matters and said I was the real problem. Then she blocked me on social media. The group chat meltdown was the final straw for many of my relatives. Some cut ties with me completely, saying I was tearing the family apart by dragging everyone into the mess. It didn't matter that my sister had been the one to start it. To them, I was the troublemaker for exposing it. Through all of this, my wife stayed calm. She encouraged me to let it go and focus on our life together. She said my family's opinion didn't matter, but I knew she was saying that to protect me. The truth was, it hurt her deeply. I could see it every time she hesitated to check her phone or avoided certain conversations. That was when I made a decision. I wasn't going to let my sister or anyone else dictate how we lived our lives. I cut off contact with her entirely and told my parents I wouldn't be engaging with the family anymore, unless they could respect my wife. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was necessary. With that decision came a sense of resolve. I stopped checking the group chat, stopped worrying about who was on my side, and started focusing on building a happier, healthier life with my wife. If my family wanted to stay in their toxic bubble, that was their choice. But I wasn't going to let it drag us down anymore. Update 3. The fallout from exposing my sister's behavior didn't magically resolve things. If anything, it solidified the divide. Despite the screenshots and clear evidence of her lies, my sister didn't apologize. Neither did my parents. Instead, they doubled down, saying I had escalated the situation by dragging private matters into public. It became clear that no matter what I did, they weren't going to hold her accountable. A few months later, I heard through a cousin that my sister had given birth to her first child, a baby girl. I wasn't surprised that I didn't get the news firsthand, but what did sting was the way it was announced. She posted about it on social media with a long, heartfelt caption thanking her amazing family for their support and mentioning specific relatives by name. My name was nowhere to be found. It wasn't just an oversight, it was deliberate. People noticed too. I got a couple of messages from mutual friends asking if I'd seen the post and if everything was okay between us. It didn't end there. When I didn't comment on the post or reach out to congratulate her, the whispers started again. My sister spun the narrative that I was bitter and holding a grudge, refusing to celebrate her happy moment. Meanwhile, I wasn't even invited to meet my niece. My parents visited her often, and they'd send group pictures to the family chat. Each one felt like a pointed reminder that I was no longer part of the inner circle. While all of this was happening, my wife found her own way forward. She threw herself into her work, started picking up new hobbies, and reconnected with old friends. It was like she had taken all the negativity and turned it into fuel for something positive. She began to thrive socially and professionally, earning a promotion at work and building a supportive network outside of my family. Seeing her flourish was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise frustrating time. For me, the loss of connection with my family was harder to deal with. I'd grown up close to them, and cutting ties felt like losing a part of myself. But every time I thought about reaching out, I remembered how they treated my wife and how they refused to acknowledge the harm they'd caused. It wasn't an easy choice, but I knew where my priorities needed to be. About 6 months after my niece was born, my parents invited me to what they called a family meeting. They didn't give much detail, but I assumed it was an attempt to patch things up. I decided to go, hoping for a civil conversation. Instead, it turned into an ambush. My sister was there, and the entire discussion revolved around her demand for an apology. She claimed I had disrespected her at the wedding, and that I owed her and the family an apology for all the drama. I refused. I calmly explained, again, that I didn't do anything wrong by bringing my wife to a family event, and that her behavior was the real issue. My parents took her side, accusing me of being stubborn and refusing to let things go. It was like talking to a brick wall. By the end of the meeting, I told them I wouldn't apologize for standing by my wife and walked out. That was the last time I engaged with the family group chat. The next day, I left it entirely. It wasn't worth the constant tension and passive-aggressive comments. I focused on the people who had stood by me, my wife, a few supportive cousins, and some close friends. That small but loyal group became my safe haven. Without the pressure of family expectations, my wife and I started building our own traditions. Holidays became simpler but happier. Instead of the chaotic family dinners, we hosted small gatherings with friends or took trips to places we'd always wanted to visit. It was a stark contrast to the past, but it felt right. Around this time, I heard through the grapevine that my sister was facing trouble in her business. She had started a boutique a few years ago, but poor management and overspending were catching up with her. A couple of relatives even joked that it was karma for the way she treated people. I didn't take any joy in her struggles, but it was hard to ignore how her controlling nature was starting to backfire. My parents, however, remained firmly in her corner. They continued to blame me for the family rift, saying I was the one tearing everyone apart. I told them, clearly and calmly, that I was open to reconnecting if they could respect my wife and treat her as part of the family. Until then, I wouldn't be engaging. They didn't take it well, but I wasn't budging. Over time, my sister's relationships with other family members started to fray. Her tendency to dominate every situation wasn't limited to me, it affected everyone. Relatives who once defended her began to pull away, tired of her behavior. I didn't gloat or say I told you so. I stayed out of it entirely. By the end of that year, my wife and I had found a new sense of peace. The drama wasn't completely behind us, but we were in a better place. We had a smaller, more genuine support system, and had let go of the toxic dynamics that once consumed so much of our energy. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was a life I was grateful for. Update 4. After months of limited contact, my sister's behavior started catching up with her in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years, her controlling nature had been tolerated because most people didn't want to deal with the fallout of pushing back. but cracks started to show when she tried to take over the planning of another cousin's baby shower. She insisted on dictating the guest list, the venue, and even the menu, despite not hosting it herself. When the actual host stood her ground, my sister stormed out of the planning meeting and refused to attend the shower altogether. Word spread quickly, and for the first time, more people in the family started seeing her for who she really was. Around the same time, I heard through a cousin that my sister and her husband were having financial trouble. Her extravagant wedding had been far more expensive than she let on, and it left them buried in debt. She tried to keep up appearances, but the cracks were hard to hide. Her husband was reportedly frustrated with her spending habits, and it was causing tension in their marriage. A cousin hinted that divorce was already being whispered about among their mutual friends, but I stayed out of it. I didn't want to get dragged into another round of drama. My parents, however, didn't hesitate to get involved. They reached out to me, asking if I could help the family by pitching in financially to support my sister. I couldn't believe it. After all the insults, rumors, and public humiliation, they thought I should bail her out. I politely but firmly told them no. They didn't take it well. My mom accused me of being vindictive and claimed I was letting my pride tear the family apart. But I stood my ground. I wasn't going to reward her behavior, especially not at the expense of my wife and our life together. Meanwhile, my wife continued to handle everything with grace. She never retaliated or spoke poorly about my sister, even when she had every right to. That quiet dignity earned her the respect of a few family members who had stayed neutral during the drama. A cousin even told me privately that my wife's behavior had made them reconsider their initial stance on the situation. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next big blow-up happened at a mutual friend's birthday party. My wife and I had been invited, and we debated whether to go, knowing my sister might be there. In the end, we decided to attend. It wasn't fair to miss out on celebrating with our friends because of her. Everything was fine at first. We mingled, caught up with old friends, and stayed on the opposite side of the room from my sister. But as the night went on, she made her way over. She loudly accused me and my wife of turning the family against her, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Before I could respond, a few mutual friends stepped in. They defended us, saying they had seen through her manipulations and that her behavior was the real issue. It was the first time anyone had publicly called her out, and she didn't take it well. She left in a huff, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. But after she was gone, several people came up to us to offer their support. It was a small but meaningful moment. A few weeks later, a cousin posted a detailed account of the wedding drama on social media. They left out identifying details, but it was clear to anyone in our circle who the story was about. The post went viral, with thousands of people commenting and sharing their thoughts. Most sided with us, calling out the sister's behavior as controlling and unfair. The attention was overwhelming, but it was also validating. For the first time, the broader narrative wasn't being controlled by her. When my sister found out about the post, she was furious. She accused me of orchestrating it, even though I had no idea it was going up until after the fact. She went on a rant in the family group chat, claiming I was trying to ruin her life. But the damage was already done. More family members began distancing themselves from her, citing her behavior not just toward me, but toward others as well. Through it all, my parents refused to acknowledge her behavior. They continued to blame me for the family's disintegration, insisting I should have just apologized and kept the peace. I stopped trying to argue with them. Their loyalty to my sister was unwavering, and I realized I couldn't change that. At the same time, my wife's family, who had previously stayed out of the drama, stepped in to offer U.S. support. They invited us to more family gatherings, checked in regularly, and made it clear that we were valued members of their circle. It was a stark contrast to my own family, and it made the decision to step away from the toxicity feel even more justified. Then came an unexpected opportunity. I was offered a job abroad, a position I'd dreamed about for years but never seriously considered because of family ties. This time, there was nothing holding us back. My wife and I decided to take it. Before we left, I met with my parents one last time. I laid out clear boundaries, telling them they were welcome in my life if they could respect my wife and our marriage. If not, I wasn't interested in further contact. They didn't respond well, but I was at peace with it. A month later, we packed our bags and started a new chapter abroad. For the first time in years, the weight of family drama was off our shoulders. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it felt like a fresh start, and that was enough. Update 5. Moving abroad was one of the best decisions my wife and I ever made. It wasn't just a physical shift, it was a chance to leave behind the endless cycle of drama and start over. Life felt lighter, and for the first time in years, we could focus on building something new without the weight of my family pulling us down. Back home, though, my sister's world was starting to crumble. Her controlling behavior, which had driven a wedge between us, began to push others away too. I heard through mutual connections that her circle of friends had shrunk, and she was no longer invited to certain family events because people didn't want to deal with her demands. Her social isolation wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable enough that relatives started whispering about it. Then came the news about her marriage. It didn't even last a year. A cousin mentioned that the financial strain from her wedding and her domineering attitude had been the main reasons. Her husband apparently couldn't take it anymore and left. I didn't feel vindicated by her struggles, but it was hard to ignore how much her behavior had contributed to her own misery. My parents tried to hold things together, but even they started feeling the effects of her toxicity. Relatives who had once sided with my sister began distancing themselves, and my parents were left to manage the fallout. Eventually, they reached out to me. Their tone was different this time, less accusatory, more regretful. They wanted to talk, to mend the relationship, but their messages carefully avoided acknowledging what had caused the rift in the first place. I replied politely but kept my boundaries firm. I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds unless they were willing to take accountability. Meanwhile, my wife was thriving. The move had given her career a boost, and she quickly made a name for herself in her field. She earned accolades and even got promoted within her first year. She also started volunteering at a local organization, which helped her build a strong social circle. Watching her succeed and find happiness made everything we'd been through feel worth it. We also started creating our own traditions. Holidays that used to be dominated by chaotic family gatherings became cozy celebrations with close friends. We hosted dinners, explored new places, and even started a tradition of taking a short trip every New Year's to reflect on the past year and plan for the next. These small, intentional choices brought us closer and gave us a sense of fulfillment we hadn't felt in a long time. Occasionally, I'd get updates about my sister. She continued to spin narratives about me and my wife, but her credibility was dwindling. After the viral post about the wedding drama resurfaced, even more people saw through her manipulations. The post gained traction again, and this time, strangers chimed in, sharing similar stories about toxic family dynamics. The overwhelming support for our side was a strange but comforting validation. Unexpectedly, one of my aunts reached out. She had been one of the relatives who initially sided with my sister, but she apologized for not standing up for us sooner. She said she regretted staying silent and wanted to offer her support. Her message was genuine, and it opened the door for a few other cousins to reconnect as well. Slowly, I started rebuilding relationships with the family members who were willing to approach things with honesty and kindness. Back in the States, my sister didn't change. Instead, she doubled down on her manipulations. She tried to shift the blame for her failed marriage onto others, claiming she had been abandoned by her family and betrayed by those closest to her. But at this point, few people were listening. The more she tried to control the narrative, the more obvious her behavior became. Amidst all this, my wife reached a major milestone in her career. To celebrate, I planned a surprise party for her, inviting our closest friends and a few of her colleagues. Seeing her surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her and celebrated her achievements was a moment I'll never forget. It was a reminder of how far we'd come and how much we had built together. Then came the unexpected twist. My parents finally confronted my sister. I heard from a cousin that they had an argument where they acknowledged that her behavior was the root cause of the family rift. They told her they couldn't keep defending her and that she needed to take responsibility for her actions. It didn't fix everything, but it was a step I never thought they'd take. After that, I wrote my parents a letter. It wasn't an olive branch, exactly, but it was an honest expression of where I stood. I told them I was open to rebuilding our relationship if they could genuinely support my wife and acknowledge the harm that had been done. I didn't sugarcoat things, but I also didn't close the door entirely. Their response was cautious but positive. They wanted to try. Now, years later, my wife and I have settled into a life that feels right for us. The drama isn't completely behind us, but it no longer defines our days. We've chosen to focus on the love and support we've built, leaving the toxicity of the past where it belongs. The future feels hopeful, and for the first time in a long time, that's enough. I'm a 29-year-old guy, and my life recently took a turn I didn't see coming. A few months ago, my older brother, who's 35 and has been wildly successful as an entrepreneur, gave me what can only be described as the gift of a lifetime, his second house. It wasn't some small, rundown place either. It's a beautiful 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, fully furnished and move-in ready. I'm still not sure how to wrap my head around it. It all started when he told me he had something important to discuss over dinner. He's the type of person who keeps his cards close to his chest, so I didn't think much of it. But as we sat there, he handed me an envelope. Inside was the deed to the house with my name on it. At first, I thought it was a joke. He laughed when he saw my face, but he was dead serious. He said he wanted to do this because I'd been there for him during some really rough patches in his life, and this was his way of saying thank you. We got the paperwork done a few weeks later. Everything was official, and the house was legally mine. I moved in shortly after and started settling into the idea of having a place to call my own. It felt surreal, but I was beyond grateful. What I didn't realize was that this house was about to become the center of a storm I never expected. I didn't tell my parents right away. Not for any particular reason, there just wasn't a moment where it came up. But word eventually got around, and when they found out, their initial reaction wasn't exactly what I expected. My mom called, sounding confused, asking why my brother had given me the house. She kept repeating, "Isn't that supposed to be a family home?" At first, I thought she was just surprised, but the tone of the conversation started to shift. My dad chimed in later, agreeing with her, saying they had assumed the house was meant for all of us, not just me. I tried to explain that my brother had given it to me specifically. It wasn't like the house was some ancestral family property. My brother bought it a few years ago as an investment, but that didn't seem to matter. They kept bringing up how it was part of the family bloodline now and that it should be treated as such. I thought this was just a misunderstanding, something we could talk through and clear up. I couldn't have been more wrong. Not long after, my parents started making themselves comfortable in ways I hadn't agreed to. My mom invited some of her friends over for coffee at my house without telling me beforehand. I came home one day to find my dad rearranging furniture in the living room. He said he thought the layout I had didn't flow well and that this was better. It wasn't like they asked or even gave me a heads up. They acted as if this was a communal space that they had every right to manage. I sat them down to have what I thought would be an easy conversation. I politely reminded them that the house belonged to me now, and that while they were welcome to visit, they needed to respect my boundaries. I even went as far as offering to let them stay occasionally if they needed a break or just wanted to spend time together. But the more I talked, the more their faces hardened. My dad cut me off and said, "This is still a family home. You're just living in it." From there, things spiraled. They started showing up unannounced more often, sometimes with groceries or random decor items they thought would improve the place. When I asked them to stop, they brushed it off like I was being ungrateful. Then came the extended family. Somehow, my parents had managed to spin this story to my uncles, aunts, and cousins, making it sound like I was selfishly hoarding a family heirloom. Suddenly, I was getting calls and texts from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all telling me I needed to do the right thing and let everyone enjoy the house. The final straw came when I found out they were looking into whether they could legally challenge the transfer of ownership. I got this information through my brother, who'd overheard them talking to someone at a family gathering. When I confronted them about it, they didn't deny it. Instead, they doubled down, saying they had a moral obligation to make sure the house stayed within the family. At this point, even my brother was fed up. He called them out, saying the house was a gift and that they needed to respect that. They didn't take it well. My mom started crying, accusing him of turning his back on the family, while my dad said he was ashamed of how disrespectful we'd become. My brother told me to avoid getting into arguments with them and to let him handle it, but things kept escalating. I could feel the tension building every time I saw them or got another message from a cousin trying to mediate. I was stuck in this strange limbo, trying to enjoy this incredible gift while navigating a minefield of family drama. It became clear that the only way forward was to have a serious, no-holds-barred conversation with my parents about boundaries and what would happen if they kept crossing them. And that's where things stand. I'm gearing up for a confrontation that I know won't be easy, but at this point it feels unavoidable. This house was supposed to be a fresh start, but now it's become the battleground for a fight I never wanted. Update 1. After weeks of tension, I decided it was time to sit down with my parents to have a serious conversation about boundaries. We met at their place one evening, and I laid everything out. I explained again that the house was mine now, legally and unequivocally, and that while I valued our relationship, they needed to respect that. I even reminded them that I was happy to have them over as guests, but that they couldn't keep treating the house as if it belonged to everyone. The reaction was immediate and explosive. My mom's voice started rising, and she accused me of being ungrateful. She said it was disrespectful to speak to them that way, especially after everything they'd done for me growing up. My dad joined in, saying that they were only trying to protect what was rightfully theirs. It felt less like a conversation and more like a barrage of guilt and accusations. Before I knew it, they had looped in other family members. The next day, my aunt called, asking why I was pushing my parents out of their own home. Apparently, my parents had told her and others that I was being controlling and trying to exclude them from the family. By the end of the week, I had uncles and cousins reaching out, some trying to mediate, others outright scolding me for being selfish. My brother got wind of this and decided to step in. He met with my parents and told them, in no uncertain terms, that the house was a gift to me and that their behavior was out of line. He pointed out that they were causing unnecessary drama and that the house had never been intended as a family asset. My parents weren't having it. They claimed my brother had acted impulsively and that he should have discussed such a big decision with them first. They framed it as him putting his own interests above the family's. Things escalated even further when I came home one day to find them inside the house. They weren't just visiting. They were rearranging the furniture again, this time moving my dining table to a different spot because they thought it would look more welcoming. I couldn't believe it. I hadn't given them a key, so I had no idea how they'd gotten in. It turned out they'd kept a copy of the spare key my brother used to have. That was the last straw. The very next morning, I had the locks changed. I didn't tell them right away, but they found out soon enough when they showed up unannounced a few days later and couldn't get in. That led to another blow-up. They started telling everyone I'd kicked them out of their own home. My dad called me, demanding an explanation, while my mom was crying in the background. I hung up after telling them they needed to stop this nonsense. Then came the threats. My parents told me they'd disinherit me unless I agreed to let them have reasonable access to the house. They didn't define what that meant, but I wasn't about to negotiate. I reached out to a few close friends, and they were incredibly supportive. One of them even recommended a lawyer they knew, just in case things got worse. The lawyer confirmed that the house was legally mine and that my parents had no claim to it, but he suggested I keep all communications documented. Meanwhile, my parents started playing a different game. They began showing up at the house with little gifts like flowers or homemade food. At first, I thought they were trying to patch things up, but it quickly became clear they were just trying to guilt me. When I didn't let them in, they started leaving the items on the porch with handwritten notes about how much they missed me. The next phase of their campaign went public. They began posting cryptic messages on Facebook about selfish children who forget where they come from. Some of their friends and even a few extended family members started commenting, offering sympathy and saying things like, "Family should always come first." I even got a couple of anonymous messages, probably from distant relatives, urging me to forgive and forget because life is too short. My brother and I had a long conversation about everything. He admitted he felt guilty for putting me in this position but stood by his decision. He also promised to back me up if things went further. That reassurance meant a lot, especially since the situation was beginning to take a toll on me. At this point, I decided enough was enough. I stopped responding to my parents' calls and texts and blocked them on social media. I let them know through my brother that I was going no contact temporarily to let things cool down. It wasn't an easy decision, but I didn't see any other way to stop the constant pressure and manipulation. I'm not sure what's going to happen next, but for now, I'm focused on protecting my peace and keeping my boundaries intact. Update 2. After going no contact with my parents, I thought things might calm down, but I was wrong. A few weeks later, I got a call from my lawyer. My parents had filed a legal claim, arguing that the house should revert to them because it was meant to stay within the family. According to them, my brother didn't have the right to transfer the property to me without their approval. It was a ridiculous claim, and even my lawyer said as much. Still, it was stressful knowing they were willing to take things this far. The court didn't waste any time. The claim was dismissed almost immediately. The paperwork was clear, and there was no legal basis for their argument. My lawyer forwarded me the official dismissal, and I felt a small wave of relief. But the relief didn't last long because, apparently, my parents had told the extended family about their legal move before it even went to court. When the dismissal came down, word spread quickly, and it wasn't the kind of victory that brought peace. Instead, it caused a new wave of drama. Some family members who had been siding with my parents started to backtrack after hearing about the dismissal. They realized my parents were grasping at straws and started reaching out to me with messages of support. But not everyone shifted sides. A few relatives doubled down, saying I should have just given them access to the house to avoid all this trouble. One cousin even called me to say I was tearing the family apart. My parents, however, didn't back down. They started calling me repeatedly, leaving messages demanding to talk. When I didn't respond, the messages got angrier, accusing me of disrespect and betrayal. One night, I had over 20 missed calls from them. That's when I began seriously considering a restraining order. My lawyer said it was a valid option given the harassment, but I hesitated. They were still my parents, and a restraining order felt like such a drastic step. Around this time, a family friend stepped in, offering to mediate. They thought they could help us find some middle ground and arranged a meeting at a neutral location. I agreed, hoping this could finally put an end to the madness. The meeting was a disaster. It started with my parents demanding an apology from me for excluding them from the family home. When I refused to apologize, things escalated. My dad started shouting and my mom burst into tears, accusing me of trying to ruin their lives. The family friend called off the mediation, saying it was clear we weren't going to reach an agreement. The next escalation came in the form of property damage. One morning, I woke up to find my mailbox smashed and my car scratched. At first, I didn't want to believe my parents were behind it, but my security cameras told a different story. The footage showed my dad walking up to the house late at night and swinging a bat at the mailbox. I forwarded the footage to my lawyer and filed a police report. It was an incredibly low point. My own parents had vandalized my property out of frustration. As if that wasn't enough, they then tried to claim they had spent money on the house over the years and demanded I reimburse them. My brother was furious when he heard this. He stepped in again, offering to pay for the repairs to my mailbox and car. But that only made my parents angrier. They accused him of taking my side unfairly and undermining their role in the family. Their justification for all of this? They said they were acting out of love and frustration. They believed the house should be kept in the family, and that their actions were necessary to preserve it. It was absurd. My brother and I both called them out, but it didn't change their stance. They were set in their belief that they were in the right. Despite all the chaos, I started to notice a shift. More family members were reaching out to me, saying they understood my side now that they knew the full story. My parents' smear campaign was starting to backfire, especially on social media. Some of the cryptic posts they made about selfish children were getting called out by people who knew the real situation. The inconsistencies in their story were becoming obvious, and public sympathy started to turn against them. My lawyer advised me to take preventative legal measures to avoid further claims from my parents. We discussed options to make it even clearer that the house was mine, including filing additional documentation. I followed his advice, determined to protect my home and my peace. At this point, I realized I couldn't keep waiting for my parents to back down. It was time to take a stand. I decided to pursue legal action to ensure they faced consequences for their actions, including the vandalism. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew I had to protect myself from further harm. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about setting boundaries and holding them accountable. Update 3. After the vandalism incident and constant harassment, I knew it was time to take stronger legal action. My lawyer helped me file for a restraining order against my parents. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but their behavior had crossed too many lines. I submitted the security footage of my dad smashing the mailbox and damaging my car as evidence. The court date was set, and I prepared myself for what I knew would be a messy ordeal. When the day of the hearing arrived, it was everything I had dreaded and more. My parents showed up with their lawyer, ready to fight. In the courtroom, they portrayed themselves as victims, claiming they had only been trying to maintain the house for family unity. They painted a picture of me as an ungrateful child who had excluded them from their rightful place in the family. Their lawyer went on about how they had invested time and effort into the house and were only acting out of love. It was surreal to sit there and listen to it all. But then it was my turn. My lawyer presented the evidence, the security footage of my dad vandalizing my property, along with the documented harassment through calls and messages. Seeing the footage play out in court was a turning point. The narrative they had carefully constructed started to unravel. My brother also took the stand. He clarified the intent behind the gift, explaining that the house was never meant to be a family asset. He described how the gift was his way of showing gratitude for the support I'd given him during tough times. His testimony was calm and factual, directly countering their claims. My parents looked visibly uncomfortable as he spoke. During cross-examination, things got worse for them. My parents were caught in several lies. For instance, they claimed they hadn't kept a spare key to the house, but the security footage contradicted that. They also denied spreading misinformation to the extended family, but I had screenshots of their messages and Facebook posts to prove otherwise. By the end of it, their credibility was in tatters. The judge ruled in my favor and granted the restraining order. My parents were now legally barred from coming near my house or contacting me directly. It was a relief, but it didn't come without consequences. News of the court drama spread quickly among the extended family. Some relatives were shocked by the extent of my parents' behavior, while others continued to take their side, saying the restraining order was a betrayal of family bonds. My parents didn't take the ruling well. They accused me of turning my back on them and vowed to cut me out of their lives. It wasn't just a threat. They followed through by announcing to the family that I was no longer welcome at family events. At the same time, they doubled down on their smear campaign, making cryptic posts on social media about betrayal from within and children who forget their roots. A local community Facebook group even picked up on the story, sparking debates and bringing in a wave of unwanted attention. Amidst all this chaos, an unexpected ally reached out, a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. She told me she had gone through something similar with my parents in the past and offered her support. Hearing her experiences was both validating and heartbreaking. It was clear this wasn't the first time my parents had let their sense of entitlement spiral out of control. The legal battle was taking a toll on my finances. Between filing for the restraining order, repairing the damages to my property, and other related costs, I was starting to feel the strain. My brother stepped in once again, offering financial help. While I appreciated his support, I could tell he was growing frustrated with our parents. He began distancing himself from them, saying their behavior had gone too far for him to continue excusing it. Despite everything, my parents weren't done. They attempted to appeal the restraining order, claiming it was unfair and based on misunderstandings. My lawyer assured me the appeal wouldn't hold up, but it still meant more time, money, and stress. Their persistence was exhausting, but it only strengthened my resolve to protect my home and my peace. The turning point came when I finally realized I wasn't alone. More family members started reaching out to offer their support after learning the full story. Some apologized for believing my parents' version of events without hearing my side. Even neighbors and friends rallied around me, offering encouragement and kindness. Slowly but surely, the narrative was shifting. Through all of this, I remained firm. The house was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me, not even my parents. While the drama was far from over, I was determined to see it through. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about standing up for myself and setting boundaries that should have been respected from the start. Update 4. After the court granted the restraining order, I decided to go completely no contact with my parents. It wasn't just about the legal boundaries anymore. I needed time to focus on rebuilding my life without the constant stress of their interference. For months, I ignored their attempts to contact me through other people, choosing instead to pour my energy into my home and career. The extended family, however, didn't let things rest. The legal battles and restraining order created a clear divide among them. Some sided with me, acknowledging that my parents had gone too far, while others stood firmly by my parents, arguing that family should always come first. Every family gathering turned into a debate, and eventually they became rare and awkward. People didn't want to choose sides, but the tension made neutrality impossible. With fewer allies in the family, my parents started to isolate themselves. They blamed me for the strain in their relationships, saying I had torn the family apart. It was hard to hear about, even secondhand, but I refused to break the boundaries I had set. I knew that if I gave an inch, the cycle of manipulation would start all over again. During this time, I began renovating the house. The damage from my parents' vandalism had left some scars, not just physically, but emotionally, and I needed to make the space feel like mine again. I painted the walls, replaced some of the furniture they had rearranged, and even added a few personal touches that reflected my style. It was a fresh start, and every improvement felt like a step toward reclaiming my peace. My brother offered to help with the renovations, both financially and physically. At first, I resisted, not wanting to burden him further after everything he had already done, but he insisted, saying it was his way of making amends for unintentionally dragging me into this mess. Together, we worked on the house, and the time we spent brought us closer. It was a silver lining in an otherwise challenging situation. Despite the no-contact period, my parents didn't give up. They started reaching out through mutual acquaintances, asking them to pass along messages or updates about their lives. It was frustrating, but I stood firm. I made it clear to anyone trying to mediate that I wasn't ready to reopen that door. Then, out of the blue, I received an unexpected inheritance. A distant relative I barely knew had passed away and left me a modest sum of money. It wasn't life-changing, but it was enough to cover the remaining costs of the renovations. When my parents found out, they were furious. They demanded a share, claiming it should have gone to them instead. They even tried to argue that it was a sign I was being unfairly favored within the family. I didn't engage. The inheritance was legally mine, and I had no intention of sharing it. Meanwhile, I threw myself into my career, and things started to take off. I earned a promotion and found stability despite the family turmoil. The success was a welcome distraction and gave me something positive to focus on. My brother was my biggest cheerleader, and our bond only grew stronger. We joked that we were the family outcasts, but in truth, we were just two people trying to navigate a messy situation the best way we could. During all of this, rumors started to surface that my parents were dealing with health issues. At first, I thought it was just another tactic to manipulate sympathy, but then I started hearing the same thing from multiple sources. They weren't outright asking for help, but the stories were carefully framed to make me seem heartless for not being there for them. It was hard to ignore, but I reminded myself that this was a consequence of their actions, not mine. Interestingly, I also started hearing whispers that they might regret how things had played out. A cousin mentioned that my mom had broken down during a family dinner, saying she missed how things used to be. But when asked if they would consider apologizing, she reportedly changed the subject. It was clear that pride was still a major obstacle. Despite the ongoing drama, I found support in unexpected places. Neighbors who had heard bits and pieces of the story began checking in on me, offering kind words and even helping out with small projects around the house. Friends stood by me through every twist and turn, and their encouragement kept me grounded. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The house, once a source of so much conflict, was finally becoming a sanctuary. Every day, I walked through its doors and felt a growing sense of peace and ownership, not just of the physical space, but of my life and decisions. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time it felt like I was on solid ground. Update 5. Months after the restraining order was granted, I got news that my parents had dropped their appeal. My lawyer confirmed it was official, and the case was closed. It was a relief, but the timing felt odd. I didn't have to wait long to understand why. A week later, an acquaintance reached out on behalf of my parents. They delivered a letter saying my parents wanted to reconcile. In the letter, my parents proposed a deal. They would respect the boundaries of the restraining order if I agreed to share the house with them. They framed it as an effort to heal the family and even suggested they would contribute to the upkeep of the house if I let them stay there part-time. I wasn't interested in compromising my hard-earned peace, but I didn't want to dismiss the olive branch without setting clear terms. I drafted a response through my lawyer, outlining my conditions. I was open to rebuilding a relationship, but the house was not up for negotiation. They would never live there, co-own it, or have any control over it. I also made it clear that any future reconciliation would require transparency and accountability. While waiting for their reply, I learned something that put the entire ordeal in a new light. A family member, someone who had stayed neutral through all the drama, came forward with a shocking revelation. My parents had been dealing with significant financial troubles for years. They had mismanaged their retirement savings and were banking on the house as their fallback plan. When my brother gifted it to me, their plans fell apart and they panicked. I shared this information with my brother, and we decided to confront them together. When we asked for an explanation, my parents didn't deny it. They admitted they had been counting on the house to secure their financial future. They justified their actions by saying they were only trying to protect the family. When we pressed them for an apology, they refused. Instead, they insisted their actions were out of necessity, not malice. The conversation ended on a sour note, and soon after, they escalated things again. They announced to the family that they were rewriting their will and cutting both my brother and me out entirely. It was a clear attempt to regain control, but it backfired. Extended family members, many of whom had stayed quiet until now, began openly criticizing my parents. Some even cut ties with them, saying their behavior was out of line. Amid all this, an unexpected ally emerged, a wealthy relative who had been following the situation from a distance. They reached out to my brother and me, offering financial and emotional support. They also volunteered to mediate, though my brother and I were hesitant. Still, their offer reminded us that we weren't alone in dealing with this mess. As the months went on, the consequences of their choices began catching up with my parents. Without financial support from their children and with fewer allies in the family, their lifestyle started to deteriorate. The social media posts stopped, and their once busy house grew quieter. Word got around that they were struggling, but I resisted the urge to reach out. I had already given them every chance to resolve things amicably. In the meantime, I found a new purpose. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping with programs for kids and young adults. It was a refreshing change of pace and gave me something positive to focus on. I also kept working on the house, making it a space that reflected my personality and independence. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was moving forward. Eventually, rumors started circulating that my parents were considering a public apology, but their actions didn't match their words. They hinted at regret during family conversations but framed it in a way that felt more like seeking sympathy than genuine accountability. I wasn't interested in performative gestures. If they couldn't take responsibility in private, a public apology wouldn't mean much. Around this time, my brother dropped another bombshell. He had decided to move abroad. He said he needed a fresh start and wanted to put distance between himself and the family drama. I understood his reasons, but it still stung. His departure left me as the sole point of contact for my parents, a role I wasn't eager to take on. With my brother gone, I made one final decision. I informed my parents, through a third party, that I wouldn't engage with them unless they accepted full accountability for their actions. No more excuses, just a simple acknowledgement of the harm they had caused. Until that happened, I would continue living my life on my terms. And that's exactly what I did. I stopped waiting for an apology and focused on building a life I could be proud of. The house, once a source of so much conflict, became a symbol of my independence and resilience. I found closure not through their words, but through my own actions. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace.